it's an incredible pleasure for me to introduce Ainat. I met Ainat a few years ago, actually before the pandemic, but she has an amazing level of experience in the area, obviously, of trauma, QED, neurofeedback, and so on. And from the perspective of education, working, her clinic in Boston, which I haven't been to, but I'm hoping to go there one day. But I think that Ainat has an amazing level of knowledge. She is the current president of ISNR, and she's always been a very passionate person in regards to everything that she has to say in relation to neurofeedback. So I certainly, it is my pleasure to introduce Ainat and for her to share all her level of knowledge. Thank you, Ainat.
You're welcome. And if we want to continue it, it's like Martha was actually the one who introduced you to ISNR. So I give you all full credit for becoming the president. And now I'm like retired president as of September. So I moved to where all the retired people go, which is the advisory board. So thank you. And I wonder, I mean, do you have a format? Like, from my point of view, you can just like stop and ask me questions. I don't think when I'm going to share the screen, I can see it, but just pitch in and I'm happy to answer questions or wait to the end. I'm not sure how it works. So, Martha, do you have any, or it's both are fine?
I think that you can share the screen. So now let's see who would be doing this section.
If somebody wants to monitor the chat or, interact, yes, ask, I'm perfectly fine. So I'm going to share my screen. And okay. Okay, so I'm going to start officially. My name is Ainat Rogel, and that's an Israeli name. So thank you for inviting me. And I would like to start with a non-trauma small introduction. So I'm still impressed that it is a small world. I'm now in Massachusetts, USA, just like Seaburn and Marty, who are also from the area. And really, thanks for technology, we can easily interact with each other and all the way from the other side of the globe. On the other hand, it's still a big world. Ever since I was a child, which was a long time ago, I wanted to visit Australia and New Zealand because of the nature, because of the animals and the vegetation. Well, because of practical reasons, it didn't work out. But about 10 years ago, I had another reason to visit. And this is when I started with neurofeedback. Miriana, ANSA, and then Martha were the first introduction for me to the new neurofeedback world and community. And they had a huge impact on my professional development. So I'm really honored to give this virtual presentation and hope that it will follow up with an in-person relationship. So I'm going to start with a motivation about my presentation. Then I know that you got like an amazing background about both developmental trauma and executive functioning. Still, we will get a little bit about some basic terms, so we will all be on the same page. We will continue with the adult and child studies and the discussion. So my presentation is going to focus on two studies. So let's start with the motivation. So when I started working with people with trauma, I said that when that neurofeedback was helping people with reduction of the classic symptoms of the PTSD, of the flashbacks, of the re-experiencing, nightmares, sleep, night terrors, avoidance, places, events, or people. But we also very happy when we were able to reduce the hypervigilance, the anxiety, and the depression. But over the time, I actually found out, both in our practice and also in the studies, that most individuals with developmental trauma, that are adults as well as children, seek for help because they want to address issues such as emotion regulation, behavior activity, or attention, which are all part of the executive functioning. And indeed, they are all being affected by the trauma. So for the adults, these issues impact their work and interpersonal relationships. For the children, it was the attention, the emotion, and behavior regulations that disturb the class dynamics in the school. And then the next step was that the parents were often given an ultimatum from the school that either to medicate the child or to find another school. Sometimes the medication did not work, and then the child started accumulating more and more medications and more medications for the side effects of the medications. And also, all on the way, it was the very many diagnoses that they have. And these challenges that these children had did not only affect the individual, but also the family, the school, and the environment dynamic. So here are some of the typical examples from the child study that I conducted that were the reasons for the parents to participate in the study. He keeps jumping to the street. I told him many times, probably to stop. He even got hurt by cars several times, but he doesn't learn that he can get hurt. He doesn't understand that getting hit by a car is a consequence of jumping to the street. Another caregiver said, I keep telling her how to solve the problem. The directions are simple and clear, and she still can't follow them. Or they get triggered so easily. They get mad, cry, and angry in no time. They keep fighting, throw things. They can't keep any part of the body to themselves. They don't know where the hands end and where others start. Again, these are the executive functioning issues that these kids had. And then the good news from one of the parents at the end of the study was, as a first-hand observer and an ever-present mama bear, I implore to all of you that neurofeedback is your loved one's pathways to hope and a lifetime of freedom. So before we go to the studies, I would just, again, like in the basic level, to talk about the basic terms of it. So developmental trauma is, sadly, even in 2022, is the elephant in the room. And it's being lost in time and concealed by shame, secrecy, and social taboo. What is it? The official, one of the many official definitions is chronic exposure to violence, abuse, and or neglect in early age. And these kids, afterwards adults who have it, they don't have a baseline. Their baseline is already, they're born into this developmental trauma. It's all this chronic exposure. They don't have, most of them, I don't say all of them, but many of them do not have any memories of, having a good baseline. They start with this chronic exposure. Why is it important? Well, it's still arguably most of the chronic public health challenges. Maybe not now with the corona, but it's going hand in hand with it. How does it impact? Because it has negative impact on the well-being, mental and neuronal development. It's like, like something that sends, the fingers and impact on so many aspects of the life. So let's move now to executive functioning, which is the other half of the title. So we really need a good executive functioning to read this definition of what is this executive functioning. But the idea is that it's a higher level of cognitive process. And then we have a long list of what it means. So it's slower in the processing. The limbic system is much stronger, faster, and coming in place much before the executive functioning, but it's a higher level of functioning. When we talk about the executive functioning, we talk about the nature, which is the genetics, is the blueprint of what we get. We have the nurture, which is learning to develop them throughout life. But for this, we will need somebody to show us how to develop it. It peaks at age 3 to 5 and in adolescence, early adulthood, and sadly, the news are that it keeps developing now until age 24, 27. So every time we learn that it's actually slow, like it's getting slower in age. So when we have adolescents, it doesn't mean that they will stop being adolescents when they're turning 20 at this point. We have to wait a little bit more longer. This is like for the adults or the parents of us. The adults or the caregivers or the people that interact are setting up the frameworks for the children to live and to learn executive functioning skills. So this is the learning process throughout life, especially from these two bits. But now the question is, what happened if not? And this is what is happening to people with developmental trauma. When we talk about the executive functioning, we talk about cognition, behavior, emotions, and socializations. Okay. So cognition is, the definition is acquiring information and understand through experience, mental flexibility, and adaptability. And now we see what happened to the kids, that it's actually challenging for them to get there. The second one is the behavior, and this is the way that we act to respond to a stimulation. Emotional control and the ability to regulate our own emotional state and what happened if not. And the social interactions is the ability to interact with people and different environments. And this is also something that is being impacted by the developmental trauma. Now, when we look more in a neurological way, there are three components for the executive functioning: working memory, inhibition, and flexibility. And we can see that people with high ACEs, and ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, they showed significant impairment on all the three of them. So the bottom line is executive functioning is being compromised. Brain image study have reported that children with symptoms of PTSD have reduced prefrontal cortex gray matter volume, which again adds some to the impairment of the prefrontal activity. So if we want to summarize this introduction, is when we have developmental trauma, and I'm focusing on developmental trauma, is excessive activity of the limbic system, the fear brain, reduced activity of the prefrontal cortex. And one of the roles of the prefrontal cortex is to put some brakes and inhibit the activity of the limbic system. So when we have now an executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex, and it doesn't work the way that it should be, it means that now the limbic system can continue working and working and working. This is one of the reasons that talk therapies may be reduced, the effectiveness of them may be reduced, because the parts who are active are the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of all the talking, not all of them, but on talking therapies is here, and it's not really working, and it's also being checked out from the limbic system. So I don't have to convince you that neurofeedback is one of these ways that are not a talking therapy to treat. And that's why we're going to go straight to the adult and the child studies. Similar to what I said in the introduction, when we started with the studies, both with the adult and the children, the main goals was to reduce the PTSD symptoms. Also added a little bit about executive functioning because we knew the theory, but we never thought that training T4, P4 is going to improve so much the executive functioning. This was really, for us, was the bonus. And it was relatively surprising in the results. So I know the children are coming before adults, but to do studies with adults, it's easier than to do it with children. So we started with adults, and that was back in 2016 with based on Bessel van der Kolk funding, and he was the one who led the studies. So the study design included, it was a random control study, which means that there were two groups and each of the participants was randomly assigned to one of the two groups. It including 52 adults with PTSD as a criteria. And I can tell you that one of the criteria of the PTSD does not really reflect people with developmental trauma. But the idea here is to try to balance between the strength of the study and the need for the need for people with developmental trauma. So we know that it excludes a lot of people with developmental trauma who did not have PTSD, but we needed to start somewhere. So they were randomly assigned either to the active neurofeedback group or to the control that were a waiting list, which means that they did the assessment that they needed to do. And after they finished this period, they started getting the neurofeedback. So in the study, we have 4 assessments that we did. One is the baseline to know actually if the participant meet the criteria. The second one was after 12 sessions, which is halfway of the neurofeedback, or 6 weeks for the waiting list. T3 was the post-neurofeedback, or 12 weeks for the waiting list, and T4, 1 month follow-up. We had one protocol of T4, P4. The inhibition was 2 to 6 and slow activities, and 22 to 36 as fast activity. The reward was 10 to 13 as a starting point, which could have been adjusted. It was, neurofeedback was performed twice a week for 12 weeks for a total of 24 sessions. Any questions until now? Okay. So the inclusion criteria, that was back when we still had DSM-4. They met PTSD diagnosis based on the CAPS, which is considered as the golden assessment for PTSD. The exclusion criteria was mainly stability and also medications. So the assessments, if we want to know what were they, there were the CAPS, which we did it only once. We did it actually more than once, sorry. We performed them in the first one at the end of the neurofeedback and 1 month follow-up. The brief, which is the behavioral rating inventory of executive functioning, which is what we're going to concentrate today. Another one was for a trauma scale, and then also the IASC, which we also did in all the timelines of the assessments. So this is the results of the summary, the summary of the results. And what we see which is the significant improvement in the executive functioning according to the brief in affect regulation, identity impairment, abandonment concerns, and tension reduction activity. Then we talk also about like that there was significant reduction in the diagnosis of PTSD according to the CAPS. So we will start with this one. You can see here the waiting list. Yeah, there is some placebo effect. There's nothing we can do about it. And here we're going down to the neurofeedback. So the x-axis is the timeline, pre, post, and 1 month follow-up. And this is the symptom severity according to the CAPS total. And you can see how much it drops for the neurofeedback. And the good news also that even 1 month as a follow-up, it went down a little bit even more. So for us, it meant that for 1 month follow-up, it was enough to keep the improvement. So if we want to get more into the details about these are the parts of the executive functioning that actually significantly improved. And this is like good for these people. Oh, why I do not have the graph here? That's weird. Okay, so if we would like to see it also in numbers, I'm not quite sure that we really need it, but this one is significant shift, inhibition total, again, significant improvement shift, emotional control, significant self-monitor, initiate working memory, plan or organize, behavioral regulation, global executive composite. That was amazing for these people. And we also saw the reports that meant a lot for them about this improvement in the executive functioning. So what is the takeaway for us? So and also the interesting thing, neurofeedback was performed at the back of the head. The improvement was here in the frontal lobe and the executive functioning. Network effects, yes, now everybody talks about it, but we still need to show it scientifically that it works. Okay, 24 sessions were sufficient to maintain the improvement for 1 month after the neurofeedback treatment. And again, I think that we did not have funding, but longer follow-ups would be also important to have. One of the things that we kept seeing afterwards is that while the subjective questionnaires showed significant improvement, the objective measurements of the EEG did not. We tried many types of analysis. We tried as the Q, we tried to do it in different ways to analyze. We were not able to find a significant improvement. And one of the reasons that we might think is that there are too many variables, the groups were too small, or we don't know how to analyze the EEG. We were able to find improvements in the individuals, but not as a group. So we saw that the study of the adults went really smoothly and really nicely. And we said, okay, we saw it on the adults, but the adults already developed the coping skills. They were relatively, upper middle class there. What was going to happen with the kids? The kids, the brain is going to continue developing. And hopefully, when we're going to do this study, we're going to help the brain to develop in a better way in the future. So we went now to the kids. And we see that the results are similar. Significant reduction of PTSD symptoms, improve executive functioning, and also reduce behavioral issues and anxiety, depression. Okay, and here also external and internal symptoms. So what are the inclusion criteria? We're talking about kids ages 6 to 13. It's a different world to treat a kid who is 6 years old than an adolescent already who is 13 years old. We did it because it was really hard to recruit the kids. And that was one of the challenges that we had. because the kids that we geared for, the ones who are in inner city places, they were not able to come to the trauma center twice a week. The parents or the families were too overwhelmed to bring them. Even when we tried to reach out to the communities, they still were not able. So we're going to see here that it's interesting the type of the participant that we ended up with. But that's also caused us to increase the range of the ages. So they suffered from at least 2 types of trauma and clinically significant symptoms of behavior, which is CBCL, either internalizing or externalizing, or met criteria for PTSD. They're in stable conditions and they have commitment to the study, means that they can come and do the neurofeedback. Now, you can see here that it's not only PTSD. It was in one way to accommodate the kids who do not meet criteria for a PTSD, but also because we were not able to find participants, so we had to extend the inclusion criteria, but we always knew that it's reduced the strength of the study. Exclusion criteria, again, similar, mainly safety concerns. They needed to live, near the trauma center, so somebody can bring them there. Medications, again, with benzodiazepine, which slow down the learning process. And this, by the way, was a huge exclusion criteria because, as sad as it is, even 6 years old are already on benzos against anxiety. So, what is the demographic of the participants that we had? Because of the difficulties that I talked about before, most of the participants were adopted by upper middle class caregivers. And you can see it here, like 26 and 12, well, actually, most of them, let's say it this way. Most of them were adopted. And these are the parents who got this ultimatum from the school, or when they got the kids, they told us, we thought that 1 year of unconditional love is going to erase everything that these kids had. And sadly, it didn't happen. And it was sometimes very hard to hear them, that they all said, we did not know what we're getting ourselves into. They're our kids, we love them as they're our kids, but I don't know if we're going to do it again. So that was hard to hear. And yes, it disrupted the family dynamic. These kids many of them were threatened to, either you're giving them the medication or we're kicking them out of school, like very straightforward. And they knew, because they're more educated, they did not want to start giving all the medications for the kids, or they saw that the medications did not help them. Another interesting fact here is that 2/3 are boys and 1/3 girls. And one of the things that we found out, and again, I don't say that it's a boy thing, it's only in the study, most of the boys were exhibit externalizing symptoms, and the girls were more internalizing. And again, when you have external behavior, it disrupts the school and the dynamic. When you have internalizing, so you're just spacing, but it doesn't bother anybody. So yes, you might have attention issues and they will give you some stimulants, but it doesn't bother anybody. And when we look at the trauma history of these kids, we can see that most of them had neglect, loss, and forced displacement, which is not surprising that we think about it. And also, most of them had separation. Again, based on the demographic, it's not surprising. But what we can see here, that the average of even a 6 years old is already 7 types of trauma per participant. Minimum of the exposure, we did not even have 2, it was 3, maximum of 12. mean number of exposure types. Okay, that's perfectly fine. The flow chart or the of the study was similar to the adult, so we don't have to repeat it. And the location similar, T4, P4. Now the reward-based one is a little bit different because 6 years old, 10 to 13 is not going to be their PDR because they're younger. So what we did is that we measured the PDR, and then the reward band was 1 hertz below the PDR to 1 hertz above the PDR. So it was still a 3 hertz band. The older kids, it was already about the alpha range, like 10 to 13 or 11 to 14 at this point. Inhibition of the slow activities and the fast activities. And the length of the session was something that we were, one of the challenges that we had was about, we planned it for about 30 minutes like the adults, but in reality, the session was 6, sometimes even less, like it was 3 to 4 minutes to 12 minutes max, no more. And that was one of the things that when we learned about them, it was, we had a lot of side effects for the kids. And at some point, I'm like, we cannot do it. We just harm them. And one of the things that solved it was the length of the session. Short, very, very short. And now the rule is the longer the better, doesn't really work here with the trauma. And this is just a side comment. Even now with adults, I do not do 30 minutes. I personally do not do 30 minutes of a neurofeedback. Twice a week for a total of 24 sessions. And the assessments, again, CBCL, which is checking behavior, executive functioning, more about trauma symptoms, and alexithymia, which is how the person knows, can recognize what's going on with them. And that's also is part of the more of a higher functioning level to know it. And diagnosis of trauma, PTSD by the questionnaire of cases. So the summary is that in our situation, all of this happened, but for us, it's both a significant reduction in the behavior and in the cognition. So I would like to, any questions until now? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Moishe. I'll just turn myself on.
Hi, Moishe.
Hi, Ainat. Did you find any differences in terms of changes in internalizing between girls and boys? Because you said they seem different in terms of their internalizing and externalizing before the study. Well, that was your observation anyway.
Yeah, but again, most of the kids who came to us were externalizing.
Okay. Okay.
And again, these are the kids who are getting this ultimatum from the school, but it just happened. Again, it's such a small study, you cannot really generalize it to boys and girls. It just doesn't. We had one girl who was very externalizing and one boy who was internalizing, but most of them, it's too small of a study.
Thank you.
But yeah, it's a good question, but we really have to be careful about it, how we interpreted such results. Okay, so what I want to show you here is what was happening when we did the studies and when we got the results and then how we were able to interpret it. Because I can tell you when we did the first analysis, we almost got like attack at this point, that nothing was helpful. So you can see here that C1 is considered as T1. This is the time, the baseline assessment. The turquoise here is midpoint. C3, which is here, endpoint, like after the 24 sessions of the neurofeedback. And you can see here that the symptoms went really nicely from the beginning to the middle to the end. But look what's happening now in C4, which is 1 month follow-up, okay? This is mean for us that the symptoms start going back. And it also, parents were talking about it, and they kept telling us, these kids were actually so good and now they start getting worse. And for us as parents, it's even worse because we know that they were able to behave better. We know that they were able to regulate the emotions better. So this is not easy for us. And our conclusion, which is maybe the right one, but is that 24 sessions were not enough for them. It just did not maintain over time. And what we did after parents came to us and they told us, it's really not fair what is going on and you cannot leave us in this situation because after 2 months, it's gotten even worse. So we actually did. We got an extra funding and we did a couple of, booster sessions and they did help and they kept reducing the symptoms. We did not measure them because that was already a clinical thing and not as part of the research, but these kids gotten better afterwards. And this is an important point. And that's one of the things that they said that we really learn a lot from doing studies. And this was one of them, said the length of the session, yes, but this is also the second important takeaway here, that the 24 sessions were not enough. Now, when we did now the statistics analysis, and now you can see here, again, the x-axis is the baseline, midpoint, endpoint, and follow-up. And this is now a statistics that compare the end to the beginning and then the end to the follow-up. And you can see that in, green is the neurofeedback and the blue is the waiting list. This is the score of the assessment. Now, in the beginning, like they did it in the adults, we did baseline versus the follow-up, and we did not get significant reduction. And this is when we got our heart attack almost. But when we went and we looked at the raw data and the raw result, we started seeing what was happening. Then we went back here to this, to the statistical analysis that we did, and we saw that if we break the results into baseline to endpoint and then endpoint to follow up, then we get significant reduction here from the baseline to the endpoint, but then from the endpoint to the follow-up, the symptoms go up. And that's why we cannot compare the baseline to the follow-up. Does this make sense? Well, maybe. Okay. And you can start seeing here, one more thing here is, you can see here, for example, with the waiting list that things are getting worse, placebo, not placebo. I can tell you with the kids, it's so much depend on the time of the year. Toward the end of the school year, everything is getting wacky. In the vacation, summer vacation, everything is getting better. So it can happen. It can go lower, it can go higher. Also, because of the small study, you can see that the score is different between the waiting list and the neurofeedback. It just happened. The larger the sample is, the less of these effects that we see here are going to come into account. So the brief, when we talk about behavior regulation, this one is pretty straightforward. Again, we can see here that it goes down between the baseline endpoint and then to the follow-up. Again, metacognition, which is P equal to, well, this is like really in the border between significant and not significant. but I still added it. Nice. And you can see here, there's a big increase for the waiting list, but there's a reduction, and it goes worse during the follow-up. CBCL, this is behavioral, externalizing, internalizing, the alexithymia, and they all show similar patterns. And the case says, now what we're doing is just the score. So we have now 4 points: baseline, midpoint, endpoint, and follow-up. And you can see here the reduction between the endpoint and the follow-up. So, and this is for the waiting, for the neurofeedback. So again, if I would compare the baseline to the follow-up, we didn't do anything, almost. It's not significant. But if we start looking at the trend here, this is where the important takeaway is.
Ainat, there is a question actually from
Yes.
Michelle. Can you please share the frequency of the booster sessions? Example, once a month, fortnight, or other?
Twice a week, again, we did it for 10 to 20 sessions. Similar to what we did before. Okay, now I also want to talk about, this is when we compared the active neurofeedback group with the waiting list. And these are like the 4 time points that we measured both, like we assessed all the 4 points. Now we're going to look at the waiting list. So the waiting list, they did the 4 assessments, and at this point, they did not do the neurofeedback. Just based on the timeline, they did baseline, 6 weeks, and then they did the midpoint, 6 weeks, endpoint, then 1 month follow-up. After they finished all this waiting time and the 4 assessments, they received the regular neurofeedback treatment of the 24 sessions. And when we did the neurofeedback, we also did another timeline of T6, we call it. Where's T5 here? Sorry, it's not here. T5, which is the midpoint of the neurofeedback, then T6, endpoint of the neurofeedback, and then 1 month follow-up. So it's only number, we don't have to remember the numbers, but what we do want to remember is that it's a similar timelines like the group that got the neurofeedback. So what we see here is this is what was happening during, and this is the brief. And if you remember this big increase in the symptoms of the brief between the first and the end of the follow-up for the waiting list. So in this situation, yeah, theoretically it should be straight, but because of the small group, it went higher up. This is the brief, which is the global executive between the beginning of the neurofeedback to the end of the neurofeedback, and here between the end of the neurofeedback to the 1 month follow-up. We see the same pattern of not enough sessions here. Maybe there are other reasons, but not enough sessions because we see the increase in the symptoms. And again, like the psychological assessment, the higher the score, the worse it is. Behavior regulation, similar, right? Including the increase during just the waiting time period. But this is like the big drop here is between the beginning of the neurofeedback to the end of the neurofeedback. And metacognition, similar, CBCL, similar, okay? Internalizing, this time we can see that it did not go higher, it went to here, and then it kept dropping here. Again, this is part of, who knows, between placebo effect or the kids somehow got better because of other reasons. CAM also. So the parents' report were also, are there more questions here about the
Yes,
results?
Ainat, there is a
Yeah.
question from Moshe. Since all individuals' measures reduced from pre to post, was there a multivariate analysis that showed significance?
They were all significant reduction. Yes, I mean, that's what this analysis, they're all significant. And
Yeah.
then there's the increase in the waiting time.
The reason I ask is because clearly a multivariate analysis would also show significance. And my understanding in an experimental setup is if you've got multiple measures, you run a multivariate analysis before you do the individual ones. That's all.
Yes, yes, it's all group analysis. Yes, it's all GCM.
Yep.
Yeah. So here we're going back to the caregiver reports. And the caregiver reports is what they told us is about, again, the executive functioning is we're talking about focusing better in school, grades increase. First time he completed the test in school. He loved the session today, decided to do his writing about it. Wow. From a boy who is like 12 years old, I don't think we can get any better compliment about it. And now, and also like parents who said, wow, we actually discovered that our child is a person. We did not have to deal with all the time with the emotion and the behavior issues. We were able to talk about it, talk to her about it. And then the parents was like, that's the only place we don't have to fight with our child to come to. And I'm not even talking about like the prizes that they got. That of course could be a motivation, but still. And why I cannot go here anymore? Okay. And even the children, when you ask them, they knew what to say. And they talked about sleep and they talk about like, it makes sense what the teacher was saying. Before it was blurry. And that was something very common for the kids to say it. I feel relaxed, I feel it comes. And one of the kids who reported, that was one of the most challenging kids actually that we had in the study. And that was like his high beta were about 30 microvolt. And it's not only high beta, it's also muscle tension, especially if we talk about like T4, P4 here. And we were not able to get this high beta down, just were not. And he had a wonderful, wonderful practitioner, and he tried all this body moving, not moving, we were not. And the first time that it was like the 15 sessions, and we're like, what are we going to do about it? He was able to take his high beta down. And as soon as it happened, he was like, he just pulled the electrodes out and he ran out of the room and screamed. It's like, you are liars. You're lying to me. You kept telling me that I should do it and that's when I will feel better. But you know what? I feel worse. I felt much calmer before. And he was right. I mean, we were sitting here like Khaled, he was like the practitioner, and it's like, wow, this kid is right. That was his baseline. We took his coping skill away. We cannot just do it. So another thing that he taught us the study and that we have to do it. So fortunately, he had really supportive adoptive parents and also a wonderful therapist, which by the way is a requirement to have a therapy to any neurofeedback for a person with a trauma. And this kid also told us afterwards that he always feels himself like he's a little fly on the wall and everybody's crushing him and he wants to die. And again, he got so much better. And he was the one who came to us after a year post the neurofeedback. And his mother said, you know, he asked to do neurofeedback. He said, it helped me. Now I understand what does it mean to be calm and relaxed. But now I feel worse, so I want to continue with neurofeedback. And he, of course, got this scholarship to continue with the booster sessions. So I have a little bit, 5 minutes, yes, for just a discussion. And this is like what we learned from it. And again, we needed to do the adjustments for the protocol, especially with the reward band. We had to do it to juggle it a little bit or adjust it based on the arousal model and also based on their symptoms. Very short sessions, 24 sessions might not be enough. And what made the difference for us is when we developed this what we call the symptom checklist. And once we did it, we saw what was going on. And this is something that we're always happy to give to anybody who wants to do. And this is the tracking the symptoms after every session, 24 hours after the session. So it includes somatic issues, behavior, emotion, energy, attention, and sleep. And also that when we do the neurofeedback, the sensitive information that was revealed during the sessions. And we're talking about gender issues that one of the participants talked about. We're talking about suicidal ideation, or, like feeling that I just can't deal with it anymore. I want to end it all. And again, it's not because yes, we might want to think that we're really good in our feedback, but I think also one of the main reasons is that the brain felt safe, and then they were able to do it, to talk about it. The limitations were demographics. Again, the participants were adopted children who lived with middle upper class families. It was a pilot study, and we did some mistakes. We know that the strength is not the best because we had a small number of participants, small number of sessions. The variability is huge. We're talking about variability with number of types of trauma. We're talking about ages of trauma. And I couldn't hear Marty, but Marty is usually talking a lot about the association between the type of the trauma and the age of the trauma. And we had all of it. We had a large age range, and again, huge difference. And we had multiple inclusion criteria. The last thing is, again, one protocol that is independent of symptoms and QEEG, which now we're doing a lot in the practice when we use it. And when we talk about it, the challenges is that, well, we talked about these ones. This is the saddest part, that most participants already know that they're treatment resistant. We're talking about 9-year-old kids, and they talk about, I cannot, and they know the term, I'm a treatment resistant kid. Very, very sad to hear. And yes, talking therapy is not for this kind of populations.
Ainat, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, with questions or without?
If we could have the questions in the next couple of minutes.
There is one question there from me. Yeah.
Yes, and Rustam has a question actually.
Okay, so what I want to talk for 2 minutes is about side effects. And that's something that I'm talking more and more about it. Neurofeedback has side effects, and it's important to know it, and it's not weakening the treatment, the neurofeedback itself. It's the opposite. And once we start tracking, if Seaborn is here, I'm going to switch. Well, we can talk about side effect, but I know that Seaborn is usually talking about adverse reactions, and she's right about it. Side effects is more, like medical side effects, but there are side effects or adverse reactions, but we need to track them. And the good news for us that they're transient, they're mild, but they can get worse if we don't do something about it, and they're reversible. So so one night the child did not sleep, but that means that if we know that it was because of the neurofeedback, we will do something about it. So in the next time the child will sleep. But we do want to be aware of it. what we would like to continue doing is, yes, we would like to have more funds to do it. We would like to learn to do more analysis, especially for the EEG, and to find neuromarkers that would tell us how we can continue reducing the symptoms and improve the kids or the adults like quality of life. Okay, so I think I'll be done with this. Oh, I just want to acknowledge all the people from the Trauma Center who were part of these studies. And thank you.
Thank you, Ainat. Rustam, you had a question?
Yes.
Yes. Well, it seems to be the issue with neuroplasticity as well should be considered. That's why some neurostimulation could help probably to, in combination with neurofeedback, can help to improve the process. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, this was the study. So it included only this one. Yeah, neuromodulation can help. It's depend how you do it, and it's also depend how many of the people, parents and individuals are willing to do it, because now we're talking about active treatment and not so much of a passive treatment.
Yeah, thank you.
Julian, you have a question.
Thanks, Ainat. I wonder about homeostasis in systems, and it's more of a clinical question because I'm sure it wasn't included in the studies, but how much do the family systems around kids, when you suddenly change their behaviour in a short period of time and then that stops, kind of enact things to let the brain get what's familiar rather than what's good? I just wondered about that. I know with some of the kids I work with, I think that's part of what happens.
Can you repeat it again? I'm sorry.
So the children living in families, and the families are used to the children behaving in a certain way, and the neurofeedback changes that. How much do you feel as though there are relational or systemic kind of factors or forces that kind of push the system back to homeostasis, that push things back to the way that they used to be? Would you consider doing kind of family therapy or, the parent training stuff that doesn't work with these kids before neurofeedback in conjunction, so that I wonder if that might help it hold a bit more?
I'm sure. I mean, family therapy is, is always helpful. And again, it's not that we significantly reduced the symptoms. We did not eliminate them. And there could be ways to make it better, right? And when we talked about like the increase in the symptoms when things got worse, that was hard for the parents. And I don't know if they have, if many of them had family therapists, but I think it's always a really important thing, especially because some of the families had 2 or 3 kids that were adopted. Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm always, like I said, neurofeedback and therapy, always.
Any other question? We have 1 minute. Yes.
Nerida, is it?
Nerida, yes. We can't hear you, Nerida. Nerida, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Ainat, that was really interesting. And I think it's sort of following on from the previous question, but I find these side effects that we call often tie in with their cognitive improvement with the treatment. And it's almost like a grieving process comes through when they're recognizing how they used to be compared to how they are now. Yeah. And I always incorporate treatment for trauma, basically with EMDR through the process of neurofeedback. And I find that eliminates a lot of the reactions. And I also do much longer sessions than that, than your 15 minutes. And I just wonder, with the combination, could that reduce some of the side effects that you're talking about?
It could be. I mean, it's a good study to do. I love to see numbers.
Yeah,
I love
I'm
to do
retiring.
studies. Well, hopefully
Yeah.
somebody will do it. But even
Yeah.
when we talk about like the different ways of doing neurofeedback, it's really depends how strong your threshold, what's your protocol. Some protocols are more
Yeah.
intense than others. So there are lots of variables about longer or shorter sessions. Like if you do the
Yes.
threshold very, very like, you know, like easy,
Minimal.
then
Yeah.
you can do a longer one. So there are lots of factors about it, but this is like for us, based on what we did, is we needed to cut our
I see. Yeah.
our sessions.
Oh,
So
okay.
it doesn't mean that, you know, everybody, but I do want also to piggyback on what you said about like things that are coming up. And one of the things that we saw is that there was a lot of sadness. And
Yes.
it
Always.
could be, and at some point we said, it's like these kids were in this overwhelmed world. There was no place for emotions. There was no place for anything because everything was just overwhelming survival. And when we brought this overwhelming down with the neurofeedback, the emotions started coming up. Yes, the loss was coming up. And that you can see it in the depression questionnaires. And sometimes, you know, whoops, depression is going up. For research, it's horrible because what do you do to these kids, right? They just get the opposite results of what you expect to get.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
in reality, this is a huge, huge, huge progress for them.
Exactly. Exactly. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ainat, and we have run out of time, but thank you so much. And it was great to actually see, you know, questionnaires such as the CBCL and the brief that are so easily, well, they're great. They're great tools. It's just a matter of using them. But I have found sort of the use of them so helpful in my own population. So to see that, you know, that you were using it, it was fantastic. So thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation, for your time. And, you know, we'll see you back.
Yeah, I hope in Australia. And if anybody wants to get or New Zealand, but I've been in Singapore 3 times already. So, but if anybody wants to get the symptom checklist, we're happy to send it to whoever. I mean, I can send it to Martha or to Miriam, and you can just take it. You don't have to do all of it. You can choose, but it just gives an idea of how to work with it.
Thank you so much, Ainat.